nerds! Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here today. We have author Robert Kershaw. Let me tell you something. The dude's a badass. You're going to hear how so. And a lot of knowledge, great conversation. But before we get to it, nerds, I still don't have an answer about what we're supposed to do at the beginning of this. Put up the poll on Instagram. Lots of votes. Basically came down to a dead heat between the way I say hello, nerds, in season 1 and get something new, Dangus. But there was ballot stuffing. You know who you are, Speed Read Scram. And turns out the Good Morning Vietnam version that I do right now did pretty well, which means we're stuck. So until somebody gives me a definitive answer, I'm just going to keep yelling at the beginning of podcasts. Everything will be fine. Power through it. Anyway, author Robert Kershaw, we talk about his book, Dunkirchen, 1940, The German View of Dunkirk. Really interesting book. It dives deep into what happened, stuff before Dunkirk, right? So you've seen movies about what happened and how British soldiers were taken off the beaches and things like that. This dives a lot further into it, has a lot of first-person point of view from the German side, just to kind of get a full understanding. It's really cool, great conversation, such a great conversation that I'm going to shut up and we're going to get to it right now. Author Robert Kershaw, let's bring him on. And here we are with author Robert Kershaw, Dunkirchen, 1940, fantastic book about Dunkirk and everything that led up to it. Bob, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
Now, we talked right before I hit record. I said the name of the book. Can you say it the right way real quick?
Dunkirchen.
Now, I want to point out right away, before I mess up any other German words, that I am really at a disadvantage because you speak fluent German, right?
Yes.
Got it. I'm really at a disadvantage.
It's not a problem.
So, Bob, your background, to even try and go through it, we like to do a little bio up front. However, an entire episode we would need to go through your biography. So let's just start with, I believe you are a certified badass. That's what it says over here, certified badass. You were in the parachute regiment.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What's that?
We only have one airborne formation in the UK. Which is the Parachute Regiment, founded in 1940. They wore the red beret, of course, and I joined in the early 70s. I've served in Western and Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. I've been on active service in 3 areas, various tours in Northern Ireland, the First Gulf War, and Bosnia. So I ended up as a bit of a specialist in the Arctic. I spent 2 winters in the Arctic in Norway when we were made into an Arctic ski and mountain battalion, and also the desert, of course, with the Middle East. And I went through the whole gambit of regimental appointments up to battalion commander. Thereafter, I was primarily training and staff, and I did some intelligence work as well.
I have a feeling we can't get too far into that, otherwise you'd have to do something to me, right?
Yeah, I'd have to kill you if I told you too much.
Well, big question. I am in the U.S. Army. I do have my airborne wings, so I did my 5 jumps, but I have many friends who are in actual airborne organizations. So my first question for you is, how are your knees feeling? Because my understanding is just it really catches up to you.
In a sense, it does. The most damage is carrying heavy weights. Marching cross-country, mountain and ski work has taken the main toll of my knees. I mean, I've done hundreds of jumps, but I never, ever got injured. So I was very fortunate. The main damage is carrying these heavy weights under pressure and skiing with heavy weights, pulling sledges and all that sort of stuff. So that's what does the damage in the longer term.
And especially you've been in extreme environments like you just said. If I had to send you back to one, would you rather go back to the Arctic or the desert?
To be honest, they're very similar, and I enjoyed them both. The Arctic reflects the sky, blue sky, brilliant white snow. In the desert, if the sun is shining, it's golden sands and blue sky. The terrain reflects the weather, and both are beautiful in their own particular right. So a real pleasure and a challenge. Both environments are a challenge, which again was enjoyable.
I would have to say I'd go to the Arctic myself. Love the cold, hate the heat. My year in Iraq it wasn't great. I didn't have a good time. So something else, in your bio, you actually worked with NATO. That's not something that
Yes.
everybody can say, right? And especially nowadays, NATO is referenced in the news a lot with what's going on. What would you do for NATO?
Quite a bit over the years. I attended the German Staff College where I did a 2-year course, which was my staff training. I then did exchange appointments to the German Bundeswehr mountain and airborne schools. I then did a number of liaison type jobs. I was the personal assistant to 2 NATO 4-star generals. And my Bosnian tour was a NATO tour. And I was the chief PSYOPs in Sarajevo with the NATO force. And my final appointment, I was executive officer at the intelligence division of the NATO headquarters in Brussels.
So we have firmly established, and when we're talking about military stuff, you know what's going on. My next question is, I love the movie Dunkirk. Christopher Nolan came out a few years ago. I'm hoping I know the answer to this. Am I still allowed to like the movie, or was it just Hollywood trash? You got to tell me the truth, though.
Bits of it are very good. I think visually and technically it was excellent. I think too many empty spaces when there were some 10,000 troops a day going across the beaches at Dunkirk. I think we were lucky to get, a few hundred at various stages. So that kind of pulled a little bit. But I thought some of the aerial sequences, particularly the air-sea mix, when they do the raid on the ship and so on, I thought they were excellent. And in particular, the aerial sequences were very well done. So a cinematographic feast, not entirely history, but not too bad.
Well, I would suggest now, because you said it's okay, somebody should read your book and then go watch the movie. So let's talk about the book. What made you decide the subtitle here is The German View of Dunkirk, right? So what made you decide to write this book? What was kind of your point of view for it?
It was a strange gestation, really, because when I was in NATO, we were invited or asked to do a battlefield tour that involved all 3 services, Army, Navy, Air Force. And because we were based in Brussels, I said it made sense to do it at Dunkirk, which obviously involved all 3. And because I speak and read German, they said, well, would I do the German viewpoint? And I said, yes, I could do that, as long as you get me all the post-combat reports from the Bundesarchive, and I'll have a look and I'll cover that aspect. Cut a long story short, because of things that were going on in Afghanistan and the terrorist bombings in London, that was cancelled. And shortly after that, I retired. But I had this massive historical information, and I'd made up my mind that I was going to be a writer when I left the forces, which I carried on doing. And Dunkirk wasn't the first title that they wanted to be dealt with, which didn't bother me too much. So the books stayed in my attic here in the UK for a long time, some 15 years, I think. And then with the pandemic, I do a fair bit of battlefield touring, not able to do that. And when I research the books, I generally travel to archives or museums in order to get the information. And that was obviously impossible for a couple of years. And then I remember, well, I had all this stuff in the attic. So I got it down. And it's full of a lot of National Socialist turgid literature, but it does deal with Dunkirk. And so I had the time. There wasn't much else I could be doing. And so I went through it. And it quite surprised me that there was quite a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know, and I was pretty sure was probably quite new and not generally well known. And so I decided this would be a good topic to write a book, entirely just from the German perspective, because I thought there's a whole plethora of books on Dunkirk, bit of a Dunkirk industry almost, bit like D-Day and Arnhem and things like that. And I thought, well, if I was going to do it, I'd want to do it from a slightly, from a different angle, and hopefully include some new stuff. And there was new stuff in these documents.
Yeah, I remember the first detail that jumped up and kind of hit me in the face. The Germans are about to start their advance. And you're right, if you watch a couple of History Channel documentaries, the invincible German army, the Nazis are coming across the border, the first thing that jumped out at me was they still needed to use some horses to move some artillery when they kind of start this advance. That we have this picture in our heads of this invincible Germans, technological, they're ready to go, everyone's going to fall at their feet. But there was already some things that they should have been concerned about when they started this, right?
That's very true. I mean, there are some 150 divisions, German divisions, involved in the Blitzkrieg in the West, in the Western Campaign, of which only 22 were Panzer Grenadier or motorized, which is a fraction, probably representing less than 20% of the whole force. So the vast preponderance of these armies were like the Kaiser's armies in the First World War. Essentially, the infantry marched on foot, and much of their artillery and their logistics followed behind on horse-drawn vehicles.
You point out, and I've noticed that a lot more World War II books recently are pointing this out. When you ask someone about World War II and Germany, they say, yeah, the Nazis. And especially when you're talking about the German army, just because it was a German army in World War II did not mean Nazi. It was almost like there was kind of two paths within the German army where you were a Nazi and you went one way, or you were the German army. And a lot of times they didn't quite agree.
Yeah, I mean, in 1940, there were still identifiable elements from the Kaiser Reich still serving, old enough to serve, soldiers who'd fought in the First World War. Then there was the interwar period, which was the Reichswehr under the Weimar state. And so those people were conscripted but hadn't been educated under National Socialism. And then from Hitler's accession to power in 1933, in 1935, Hitler introduced conscription once again, it having been banned by the Versailles Treaty. And then those fellows coming in are schooled and educated in the National Socialist regime. So you had three elements, if you like, that characterized that first German army that did the major invasion in 1940. Now, once the Germans invade Russia, the whole character of the army steadily changes, because what happens is, with such a long campaign in such tough conditions, many of the old guys either lost out physically or psychologically, or were simply killed in the advance into Russia. So that by the time the German army reaches Moscow, it's lost the equivalent of a complete Army Group North, in terms of casualties. And that actually changes the tenor of the leadership in the German army from what had, when it started, been preponderantly First World War veterans and people trained during the Weimar period, to people who joined the army when Hitler was Chancellor, and therefore the army became increasingly National Socialist, in that the youngsters that took over the command levels at a very young age, primarily because of casualties and people being worn out, if you like, by constant responsibility of leadership in war. So there is an increasing level of National Socialist character evident in that army, which grows as the war progresses. But in 1940, that was the last time that an idealistic German army was in the field, not at this time steeped in atrocities, although some had occurred, of course, in Poland and indeed some in France, but not on the sort of industrial scale that you had on the Eastern Front, which was total barbarism.
And now the Germans are getting ready for their push. And something else about Dunkirk, as everybody says, it was the British and the French. That's who was sitting there, but kind of ignores some allies, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so. Interestingly enough, I got hold of the primary intelligence officer that dealt with enemy forces on the German General Staff. And he wrote a book immediately after the war describing his experiences. And in that, he included his estimate of what the German army would face from the French, the British, and the Belgians, and so on. And what was very interesting was that the Belgians were completely underestimated. They thought there'd be a bit of a walkover, that they'd be a bit like the French. First World War permeated in their tactics and way of thinking, and they wouldn't be too tough a nut to crack in the event that Belgians proved formidable adversaries and gave them a lot of trouble. The French, who they thought were going to be quite good, on the contrary, were not, and gave up quite easily in the initial stages. But having said that, the blitzkrieg that suddenly emerged from the Ardennes hit the French Ninth Army, which was not their best. And Hitler, interestingly enough, had identified that this was a weak point of the French front. And the best French troops were those based in northwest France, who immediately went into Belgium at the start of the invasion and were outflanked by the panzers coming through the Ardennes. So their best troops were not up against the Germans initially. But by the time the Germans had reached the coast, the Belgians have got their backs to the sea, as indeed the French, and they fight better.
And, this is that part that people mostly know about. Their backs are against the wall. They're up against the water. And this is a point, too. The Belgians fight very hard, but ultimately have to surrender. Now, what I found very interesting when you kind of pointed out is it was a shock to everyone. It seemed to be like no one saw this coming, and probably from a strategic standpoint, Belgians being out of the war is not a good thing, but tactically it seemed to be almost a gift to the Allies at this point.
Yes, I didn't even realize it myself until I went through the documents. It's quite remarkable, the failure of the Germans to recognize. Well, they had recognised that the Belgians were teetering, but they were on their last legs, and they were already keeping the French and the British informed that they were about to surrender because they had nowhere else to go and they'd been beaten to their knees virtually. But they gave their allies as much notice as possible that they were going to surrender. Of course, the Brits rather regarded this as a bit of a stab in the back, and the French were fairly unimpressed as well. But the Belgians, for example, handed over a lot of their vehicles to French units. But the main impact of all this is that it created a huge military vacuum, so far as the Allies are concerned, in northwest France, this great area where there were 22 Belgian divisions that suddenly surrender, which is already permeated by refugees who are fleeing from the Germans. So basically nothing could move on the roads. And the Belgians knew this and were not too swift in getting off the roads either. So the Germans couldn't move decisively against the coast. And this is their failure. They didn't see this coming. There wasn't a plan B. Suddenly the Belgians surrendered and the Germans couldn't get through them. They had to accept the surrender of these 22 divisions, which was thousands upon thousands of men. And the best they could do was commandeer vehicles, stick German soldiers in them and head for the coast. And of course, that is not an organised offensive. That is a series of raids to reach the coast as quickly as possible and occupy the area that the surrendering Belgian army was giving over. That meant that an opportunity really was lost, because if the Germans had got into that area very quickly, they'd have been on the east side of the Dunkirk perimeter and could have advanced along the coastline where there's an area of dunes and beach, which was wide enough for them to come through and possibly have taken the evacuation beaches even before the Brits got there. But I'm not in this sort of might have been school of history. But in terms of the potential to do things, it's clearly a lost opportunity. What could have happened, one will never know. Something else may have happened as well. But it does strike me as being remarkable that the Germans did not have a plan to deal with this. And this is characteristic of the entire advance of the Germans to the West. Hitler rather lost control of the blitzkrieg momentum to the extent that by the time they reached the coast, there wasn't really a plan what to do with the Allied units that were cut off there, because quite frankly, the Germans didn't expect to get to the coast as quickly as they did. And they thought there would be many other problems before they were served this victory, in a sense, on a plate.
It's often said that very often the German army or, leadership in general always had to wait for kind of Hitler to tell them what to do, and they had to check with him. Is that something that kind of rears its ugly head during this, that they don't quite know what Hitler wants to do? So, we'll pause the war right now while we get to ask the big man.
It was a contradiction in that it's not quite as simple as that, because the German commanders, by virtue of the initiative they showed, completely outflanked the French army and rapidly reached the coast by virtue of daring and risky leadership. They really went for it, and they were able to harness the technology of the tanks and the armoured personnel carriers and their motorised infantry and artillery and reach the coast very quickly. And then you juxtapose that against the fact that all the time, the senior German military leadership is saying, whoa, slow down, because we did this in the First World War and we were caught out at the Marne. And interestingly enough, all the contemporary diaries I read from German soldiers and commanders were remarking upon the fact it can't be this easy. They're going to do a Marne on us. We're going to get near the coast, and suddenly this counteroffensive is going to come out of nowhere, and we're going to become unstuck. So the Germans, toward the end, were risk adverse, and Hitler really had lost control of this momentum because his tactical commanders wanted to move forward and take advantage of the obvious weakness that was being shown against them at the front. Whereas the senior German officers and Hitler himself felt the need to slow up, wait for the infantry to catch up with the panzers, because they had advanced along the line of the Somme River, and there was still a lot of the French army to the south of the Somme River, and they expected an offensive to come in from that direction as well. So it was going far better than they could ever have assessed, and they rather lost their nerve toward the end. And that caused problems.
With all of that comes the infamous, any military person heard that, the infamous halt order. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What's kind of the myths around that, and what's the truth?
What happened, in a sense, is that, for example, on the 17th of May, Guderian, who is leading the 19th Panzer Corps, which is spearheading the advance, is given an absolute telling off by his superior, von Kleist, for overreaching himself and being too reckless. And Guderian immediately turns around and says, I therefore resign. That caused a bit of a crisis, and von Rundstedt, the German army group commander, stepped in and said to Guderian, no, you must continue. And so you had all these frictions. And then what happened, of course, was that Rommel's 7th Panzer Division was hit in the flank by a very weak Brigade Minus British attack at Arras, which he plotted on his mapboard in his headquarters as being assaulted by 5 British divisions when it was actually less than a brigade. And that caused a big scare, because obviously the story that was going back is, here comes the offensive we've been expecting all the while, which spooked Hitler even further. And he went forward to von Rundstedt to discuss his fears, and von Rundstedt had already decided to call a halt to enable the infantry to catch up with the tanks. But what had happened was that von Brautitsch, the army chief of staff, had stepped in and decided to, quite sensibly, regroup all the panzer forces with Army Group B that were closing in on the Dunkirk perimeter, which made sense to reduce it. And he gave that order. But he didn't discuss it with Hitler. And when Hitler discovered what had happened, he regarded this as a personal affront in a public humiliation, and told von Rundstedt he could handle it however he wished. And so von Rundstedt sort of held on for a few more days until he realized he ought to release the panzers. But that resulted in a delay of some 3 days before the panzers were released. Now, most historians think that's a big deal, and virtually every TV channel you look at that's got a documentary about Dunkirk will say, of course, the Panzer Halt order resulted in the Brits getting away. There's no doubt that if they had been released, it would have caused a lot less Brits would have reached the coast, but it's not necessarily the same as stopping them from getting away. For example, the first attack that was made on Dunkirk was by the 1st Panzer Division on the 24th of May, which was before the halt order reached them. And by the end of that day, that attack, which was the only panzer attack mounted against the perimeter, was beaten back by the French. But what is interesting is, of the 3 days of the halt order, only one of those days coincided with the 9 days it took to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force. So it's too simplistic to assume that the Panzer halt order was decisive in the outcome of the evacuation. It is indisputably important, but I wouldn't label it as decisive.
Every story I hear about Hitler, it sounds like he probably wasn't a great guy to work for. Not very level-headed. Seems to like to yell at people in public, among other horrible things.
Well, it's all about power, and anybody who really questions his authority is standing on very dangerous ground, and that included his senior army commanders. And the outcome of that was that, of course, a dazzling victory in the West, and then you have stupendous advances later, initially in the East in Russia. And so the Führer is the new Napoleon, and he can do no wrong. And Hitler actually believes this and increasingly interferes with some pretty bizarre decisions, which he had already done during the Western campaign.
Something else that your book highlights, and this is probably, I don't want to say necessarily my favorite part because there's a lot of tragedy in here, but when you talk about Dunkirk, the picture is what the movie was. These are the Brits getting off the beach, but it completely forgets that that means someone else is somewhere holding the line and they're not going to make it out. And that's a big story that's overlooked in a lot of books, but not in yours, right?
Yes, I mean, that was certainly the case because, for example, when the Belgians collapsed in the East, it was a British corps that plugged that gap. But as the Brits are starting to withdraw, the French are taking over the line. And it is the French that have the first decisive block against the Panzer attack on the 24th of May. That's the French 68th Division that stopped them from coming in. And then when the Brits withdrew from the east to be taken off the beaches, the French 12th Division filled that gap. And in particular, a very heroic defense by the 8th Zouave Regiment, North African French soldiers, who held the German 56th Division at bay in the Battle of the Sand Dunes to the east. And in fact, they inflicted so many casualties, not just then, but the Brits had already. But that division had so many casualties that it was actually withdrawn from the line at Dunkirk the day before it fell because it was no longer combat effective.
And when you talk about this, is that the reason that the Germans couldn't get to the beach? Is that the reason the Germans couldn't really get in there and just destroy everybody while they're trying to get on boats?
No, I think probably the primary reason was the terrain. If you even look at a contemporary map of Dunkirk today, you'll see that it's surrounded by a canal system and a herringbone network of drainage ditches all around the port. And when the Germans advanced on Dunkirk, it didn't matter whether you came from the west, south or east, you had to cross a minimum of 5 to 6, maybe 7 major canals to get into the port area. And each of those is like a concentric series of moats. At the same time, shortly after the Blitzkrieg began, the French also flooded the low-lying area around Dunkirk, which meant that of the 10 German divisions that were surrounding the Dunkirk perimeter, only 5 could get near it because of the floods.
It made me think a lot about, I read this right around when Russia started going into Ukraine, and I couldn't help but think that there are multiple times where the Germans, because of the terrain, because of the way they're doing it, get backed up in a long line, almost like traffic. And it really reminded me of Russia going into Ukraine, where you see pictures of this long line of military vehicles just sitting there that if you don't plan for the terrain, it'll get you.
Yeah, it's not just a train, it's also moving the troops, because when the Dunkirk perimeter is being formed, initially it's being advanced upon from two directions. You've got Army Group B under von Bock coming from the east, and you've got von Rundstedt's Army Group A pushing up from the south. Now, they are army groups. That means multiple numbers of corps, thousands and thousands of troops and vehicles coming at right angles to each other to combat in the same place. So what happens is that all around the Dunkirk perimeter, you've got a problem of parking coincidental with the flooding. No dry ground to put the artillery on to shell the perimeter, and nowhere to move troops and vehicles unless they thin out. They do start to thin out for the next phase of the French campaign, but of course, they have to get the panzer units out that are manning the perimeter and replace those by the infantry marching up. So you've constantly got these traffic jams behind the front, which delays any offensive action for days while they sort themselves out, coincidental with the fact that there was no plan anyway to reduce the perimeter. Eventually, with about the sixth or seventh day of the evacuation, the Germans placed the commander of the 18th Army, General Kuchler, as the overall commander for the reduction of the Dunkirk perimeter. And then only from that time do you get a proper cohesive plan implemented by one person to reduce the perimeter. Before then, it's the confusion of units arriving and leaving, relief in the line, and of course the tenacious resistance from the French and British troops around the perimeter.
How many troops were able to get off the perimeter? We talk a lot about, rightfully, how many people they got out at Dunkirk. How many were left?
Virtually all the French rearguard were left behind. So all the guys who did the fighting to cover the retreat in the last few days got left behind. And what is also interesting is that the last Brits left on the 2nd of June, but French resistance continued until the 4th of June. So they held on for another 2 days beyond that as well. But essentially the 68th Division, the 12th Division, all their engineer, artillery assets got left behind. Many French soldiers were taken off, but the ones that did the hard fighting were left behind, which was a tragedy, of course.
It's a tragedy, and I really appreciated the time you spent with that and making sure that that was part of this narrative that I mentioned, very often gets forgotten, or it's a footnote at the end of a movie or something like that, is just to remember that somebody had to hold the line while everyone was getting on the boats.
Yeah, I mean, most people think it was all over when you get the signal that the last of the BEF has been evacuated, but actually the battle continued for another 2 days after that. And it was hard fighting for the Germans to get in.
And it's often overlooked, too, that, you talk about normal, just British people getting in their boats and going, but the actual military boats that were getting people off, they got themselves in a lot of hairy situations, really going and trying to get people off. It wasn't just they're on the dock, let's go get them. There was some crazy stuff going on to get people out.
The evacuation for Boulogne is a case in point, in that you have destroyers going into the jetties with all guns blazing, levelling factory warehouses on either side of the harbour as they're pulling the troops off the jetty. I mean, that was pretty... And two of the ship's captains were felled by snipers on the ship's bridge. So that was really the Royal Navy at its best. And then you have the actual evacuation from the beaches at Dunkirk as well. And again, what is interesting is that the Luftwaffe aren't able in any way to seriously dent the carrying capacity of the Allied fleet, which enabled them to get away. There was one English liner, the Lancastria, that was sunk after the Dunkirk evacuation, trying to get other British troops off the French mainland. It was sunk by a Ju-88 dive bomber, and that cost, they reckon, some 5,000 lives. Now, if they'd aimed at the ships that were fully laden and inflicted those sort of casualties, it would have been much more of a defeat than it actually was. I mean, it was a defeat. But the key aspect is that the British managed to get their veteran combat divisions off. And that is the important part of the battle. Although the evacuation lasted 9 days and a bit more, because they had to take off all the logistic elements first. The last guys to come off were the fighting troops. And those 4 days when they got them off were the decisive days. Now, if the Germans could have stopped that, there would have been this huge prisoner exchange problem, which would have had a political effect on negotiations, which would have been enormous pressure on Churchill to give something up.
Was there any one particular thing in your research that stuck out to you as, I never saw this before, I've never read it anywhere else? Any one particular thing that really surprised you during your research?
Yeah, there was, in fact, because many of the streaming channels, documentaries you see talk about 2 or 3 Spitfires turn up and change the entire air war over the beaches, and the Germans, they constantly quote Galland as saying, give me a squadron of Spitfires, etc., etc. The real damage was done by British bombers, which I didn't realise. It was only when I started reading all the post-action German reports that they're constantly complaining about the number of lives and vehicles they're losing to low-level British bombing attacks, which really shook them up. Because until they got to Dunkirk, the sky was theirs. And for the first time, they're being directly confronted by aircraft from the British mainland. And many of them are bombers and causing enormous grief as they're trying to get to grips with the Dunkirk perimeter. And the Germans were very sensitive to air attack as much as our own troops were.
Now, one of the reasons we founded History Nerds United is a lot of people say history is boring. I've read everything on World War II. There's too many books on World War II out there. If you had somebody in front of you and said, I'm not really into history, why should I read your book? What would you say?
Well, it's not just about what happened, it's what the people felt as it was happening. And that's part of the deal, I believe, when I'm writing. I think you're trying to bring history to life. You're not just telling a dry narrative. You're analysing, but you're putting human stories to illustrate your analysis. And I think that therefore makes it a lot more interesting.
Well, Colonel, I definitely feel a lot smarter about this. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And that's it for this episode. Robert, thank you so much for coming on. Hope you enjoyed that, nerds. Hit us up on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Go find us. Leave comments everywhere. Leave comments on the podcast. Listen to all of them. Listen multiple times. Whatever you want to do. If you can, rate us 5 stars, please. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.